Generally, the more you practice something, the better you become. And this is evident in all sorts of disciplines. Like, for example, in writing, in order to become better, a writer writes. Same thing applies to photography. The more pictures you take, the better photographer you become. And similarly in painting, if you want to improve painting, you must paint all the time. But you rarely hear architects talking about improving or keeping their design skills up to date. And so in today's video, I kind of wanted to dive into this topic to explore if there's any ways that architects can actually practice architecture. It is an interesting art form because unlike many other art, it doesn't rely on the creator to create the output. Architecture relies a lot on the middleman or somebody to actually construct the building once it's designed. And for that reason, architects have to know a lot of different skills that will help them in that process of getting the building from the initial stages up to the construction stages. So in conventional arts, whenever you have an idea, you then proceed to work. And so you work on this idea and you develop it, and then eventually you get the output. So if we for a second imagine that this creative process that I'm describing here is the writing process, then the output would be a book or some kind of manuscript. Now, of course, writing is a much more complicated process and there is a lot that goes into it. But as a simple diagram, this is how it looks like. And if we take an architecture as an example to compare it to this, then what you'll find is that there is actually a lot of intermediate steps that we need to take before we arrive at our output. So these basically consist of 3 steps. Step 1 is to design. Step 2 is to get client approval. And then step 3 is to get contractor to build the building. So we move from step 1 all the way to the step 3 and we get our final product. So we get our final output in form of building, and in the writing it would be the book. Obviously this is an oversimplification. Construction process and architectural design process is very complicated, but for the purposes of simplification, this is roughly what it looks like. And then you can also add to each of these points, you can have subcategories. And each of these categories, each of these subcategories in each of these steps, they in themselves require a certain amount of skills and practice. And for the purposes of this video, we'll look at how we can practice the design skills. The way I like to think about it is I like to compartmentalize design activities into different buckets, and I'll give these activity buckets different dimensions. So in the first bucket, what we can explore is the idea generation through kind of graphical means. So we can sketch out things like, you know, a solid and void concept. We can illustrate things like movement into the building. We can also look at different elevational treatments, how the pattern of the elevation can work. So in this we can have observations and analysis. We even can have doodles here. Doodles are a great way to get ideas. And then, as I've kind of showed here with the solid and void concept, we can think through the drawings, we can think through the doodles. The second dimension is more of practical application stuff like plans. And plans is a great way to practice the spatial awareness and also how to combine different spaces on a given plot. So because plan is such a big driver in architecture, it's one of those things that you might be spending some actual time designing on. And by the time you get to that design stage where you need to figure out the plan, typically the skills you need are kind of faded away because, you know, last time you looked at the plan is way back in university. So we can take an empty site and practice our plan on it, or we can take an existing plan and make it better, or we can put an existing plan that we previously made or found on an empty site. And finally, we have the third dimension, and you guessed it, is the 3D perspectives and axonometrics. Oftentimes is the later stages of the design process when, you know, a lot of things are figured out, but it can also be kind of early stages, you know. So, and the way to practice it is by drawing perspectives, axonometrics, and also if we want to be super advanced and we're kind of down into our process, we can also start modeling things. So a good thing about thinking in terms of practicing architecture in these terms is that we don't have to rely on the project getting to a certain stage before we start exercising that particular skill. I guess the other useful idea to keep in mind is that there should be a distinction made between creator's schedule and editor's schedule. And in arts, it means that, you know, we have to make a distinction between where we're free to create something and put things to paper versus the time we need to edit them. With architects, I think what architects tend to be is quite precious about their work. They tend to be quite perfectionistic about their work. And I think more oftentimes than not, it's hindering the process of creativity. Another thing to mention is that inevitably there are going to be days where we're completely stuck in our process and we are unable to come up with the ideas, and I think that's perfectly okay. That's a reasonable thing that happens to everybody. And I made this other video on how we can kind of lessen this problem and come up with the ideas for our architectural work in those times when we seemingly don't have anything to offer. So I encourage you to check that out, and I'll see you in the next video.